The Young and the Restless spoilers. The moment Noah's eyes opened for real, not the fluttering, disoriented reflexes of a body waking from trauma but the clear and steady focus of a mind returning to itself, the air in the room seemed to shift from grief to gravity. The monitors still hummed, the force still dripped, and the light still fell in pale ribbons across the hospital floor, but the feeling that swept through Sharon and Nick, and even Victor, who stood slightly back with the composure of a patriarch who had weathered every kind of storm, was the sensation that truth had finally found a door it could walk through. The detectives at the foot of the bed straightened without speaking. They had waited, and now their questions had a witness who could answer them. Noah's gaze moved from his mother's trembling hands to his father's set jaw to his grandfather's watchful stillness, and then to the officers who did not attempt to mask the tension drawing their shoulders tight. It would have been easy to let the relief carry everyone into silence, to allow the joy of survival to dull the blade of what came next. But survival without truth was a hollow victory, and Noah had never been hollow. He inhaled, and with that breath, fear retreated a few inches. He remembered the daughter whose tiny arms had circled his neck that morning. He remembered a letter he had written to protect her if he failed. He remembered, finally, the faces that had driven him into darkness. The room quieted around him as if the building itself understood the consequence of what he was about to say. It began with the pattern he had recognized long before the crash, a pattern disguised as opportunity. Holden had come first, polished and persuasive, a consultant with the sheen of legitimacy and a resume full of strategic turnarounds that read like a confession written in corporate language. He had spoken the dialect of the ambitious synergy, optimization, integrated growth. Yet every promise he made carried the soft aftertaste of surveillance. Sienna had arrived a beat later, social firepower meets boardroom steel, a presence designed to lower defenses and open doors. Together they were the perfect duet, one to charm the room, one to lock the vault. They wrapped their pitch in market data and trend lines, but what they were really selling was access, and not just to a product or a platform, access to the Newman orbit itself. Noah had not intended to open that door. He had wanted to build something apart from the gravitational pull of his last name, a creative and digital arm that was his own, art embedded with code, interactive archives, experiential streams that organized memory into meaning. Holden found him through that work. Sienna found him through Holden. Their earliest meetings were not threats, they were invitations. They offered support, analytics, a transnational network that would amplify his projects. Embedded in their compliments was a quiet accounting, what he had, where it lived, who touched it, how often. At first the questions seemed like due diligence. Later, they felt like reconnaissance. Noah explained this slowly, carefully, not to dramatize the facts but to keep them from fraying under the weight of emotion. He told the detectives that the offers became requests, the requests became requirements, and the requirements bled into surveillance. A back-end key that needed temporary expansion rights. A pilot integration that by necessity tunneled through a core server. An AI module he'd been prototyping that Holden insisted would benchmark better if it touched an external model. Each concession was small enough to rationalize, but as Noah spoke he described the arithmetic of compromise. One permission here, one blind spot there, and suddenly there is a corridor straight through the heart of your system. When anomalies appeared, unexplained pings in off hours, shadow processes that woke and slept like animals learning his schedule, he challenged them. Holden minimized, Sienna deflected. They pivoted the conversation to growth, then partnership, then merger. Noah began to keep a second set of eyes on his work, hidden and analog, the way an artist keeps sketches no one else knows exist. The more he watched, the more a shape emerged, a siphon pointed not at him alone but at what he could open if coerced, Newman infrastructure, Abbott relationships, third-party archives tied by metadata to people who had no idea their names were drifting through someone else's calculus. He hadn't planned to play detective. Love and work had already made his life complicated enough. But evidence does not care for convenience, and guilt, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. He told them about the night the pressure sharpened into threat. A staged strategy session was scheduled off-site, an address that looked temporary on purpose, the kind of warehouse space where startups pose for photographs to appear scrappy and hungry. The calendar invite came from Sienna's assistant, the route texted by Holden with a note that felt like a dare: "No entourage, let's keep this lean." Noah had replied with a neutral thumbs up and sent nothing else. He drove himself, head clear, a recorder running in his pocket out of an instinct he refused to call fear. The last thing he remembered before the road narrowed was a second set of headlights in the mirror where there should have been none, and then a third reflection, a tailing echo, just long enough to register geometry in the glass and understand that the triangle was not an accident. The first car pressed closer, the second drifted left to cut off the only safe exit from the curve. Noah had described that curve to the detectives as if drawing it with a pencil, how it hugged the cliff face, how the guardrail, ever a formality, waited below. His voice did not shake when he explained what came next. The tap on the rear bumper. The jolt that sent the recording skittering in his pocket. The sudden weightlessness of knowing that physics no longer favored survival. He described the calculation he made in the breath between control and catastrophe: ease the wheel right to clip the shallowest angle, ride the friction long enough to bleed speed, pray the frame held and the seatbelt took, choose the wall over the drop. The world went violent and quiet at the same time, and then the medicine of darkness swallowed him whole. He named them because the question demanded it, and because to not name them would have been to invite myth and misdirection. There was no Mitch, he said, looking directly at the officers first and only then at his family. He did not sneer at the fiction, he dismantled it. Mitch was a phantom, a name manufactured to float through rumor so that when anyone reached for blame, their hands would close around air. Holden and Sienna had invented him because the vacuum left by a faceless perpetrator is a very useful tool. It buys time, diffuses scrutiny, and sends the wrong kind of search parties into the wrong kind of night. Mitch did not call the route, Mitch did not widen the access keys, Mitch did not sit in a glass office with a curated view and move other people's lives like pieces on a board. Holden did. Sienna did. Noah had emails, calendar pings, server logs with timestamps that aligned too neatly with their support, and a half-decrypted message chain that cross-referenced finalized documents to meetings that, in reality, had never taken place. He had not planned to keep a paper trail, but the people who hunted him had left one, and in their arrogance they assumed he would not be alive to read it back to them. Sharon listened with a stillness that comes only to mothers who have learned that love sometimes requires the discipline of not interrupting. She traced the outline of the blanket with her fingertips and memorized the sound of her son's voice reclaiming the hours he had lost. Nick stood closer to the detectives now, not to crowd them but to signal that he would absorb whatever storm landed next. Victor's eyes did not leave Noah's face. There was power in his silence, the old power of a man who once learned that patience is not passivity but the older brother of precision. When the officers asked what motive could be worth this level of orchestration, Noah did not flatter Holden and Sienna with the simplicity of greed. He explained that money was the skeleton, but influence was the muscle and immunity the skin. Holden's consultancy had become a pipeline for laundering access. He sold solutions in public and permissions in private. Sienna curated social cover, the optics of legitimacy, fundraisers, charity boards, pilot partnerships, so that by the time a system was compromised, the victim had already thanked their saboteur publicly. They didn't just want Noah's work, they wanted his adjacency to power. His project sat at a junction where art met archive and archive met network, and through that junction ran metadata about people who mattered to Genoa City more than anyone recognized, who met whom, where, when, and in what sequence, which vendor touched which supply line, which lab paid which invoice. With a handful of seemingly harmless insights stitched together by a capable model, they could script a month of moves for any competitor and sell those guesses as prophecy. Until the day someone like Noah noticed that the guesses were not guesses at all, but theft in slow motion. If he had stayed quiet, he said, the crash would have worn the clothing of tragedy, and the city would have mourned appropriately before turning the page. If he had not written the letter to his parents, they might have spent their energy debating the meaning of a ghost instead of escorting a living child through fear to safety. If the child had not arrived at the hospital with the testament in her small hands, some detective's supervisor might have filed this case inside the drawer where accidents sleep. But he had not stayed quiet, and accidents have tells, and liars have habits. Holden and Sienna had already begun to overplay the story. Their invention of Mitch had sprouted the wrong kinds of branches: an associate who claimed to have met him at a gala where no such meeting occurred, a receipt that placed Mitch on a flight at the hour he was supposed to be menacing someone in a bar, a set of surveillance screenshots that, when enhanced, revealed time codes that had been rewritten 2 degrees off a camera's internal clock. Noah did not know whether they had hired the cars or driven them themselves, and at that moment the distinction felt small. The law could sort the degrees of guilt. What mattered to him now was that the lie had been named aloud in a room where naming things created consequence. The officers asked about Audra, carefully, professionally, because every name attached to Noah's life carried context and risk. He did not excuse the history, he acknowledged it. He did not sell her out to reduce the complexity, he preserved the complexity while drawing a line. Audra did not point cars at cliffs. She had done harm. She had also delivered a life to his parents' door when she knew a storm was coming for him and feared it might drag the child into the undertow. He told the police what he knew and did not speculate past the perimeter of his knowledge. He described the layered safeguards that he had set before the crash: redundant keys, dusted logs, an external audit queued to trigger if his laptop did not ping a particular server within 72 hours. He explained how, in the days before the attack, a set of non-human pings mimicked his own usage patterns with a 92% overlap, a number too precise to be chance and too imperfect to be a perfect clone. The mimicry meant someone had monitored him long enough to build a behavioral model, but not long enough to finish it. That unfinished quality became a signature, one that connected Holden's team to a short list of vendors with codebases that made the same mistake in their synthetic scheduling. Sienna knew which vendor had the flaw. Sienna brokered 3 pilots that exploited it. That was motive as architecture, not just a guess about greed. When he finished, the room did not explode into noise. It contracted, as if the facts themselves had their own gravity. Sharon pressed her palm to Noah's forearm and let relief escape in a single shuddered breath. Nick asked the detectives for their next steps and was answered with phrases that meant both soon and carefully. Victor moved just enough to be seen in the corner of Noah's eye and gave a single small nod, an old man's blessing that doubled as a battlefield signal. The officers collected copies of the logs, the letter, the video fragments he had recorded on nights when meetings sounded like traps. They asked permission to mirror the drives. Nick granted it before the sentence was complete. As they left, one of the detectives glanced at the window where the late light had gone paler and said a sentence that acknowledged both duty and debt: they were late to understanding, not late to action. The conference room inside Genoa City Police Headquarters was not built for emotion, but emotion filled it anyway. The table was littered with files, photographs, and hastily printed data logs, yet what held everyone's attention was not paper, it was Noah, pale and trembling, his voice strained with the exhaustion of trying to prove what he already knew in his bones. His testimony had shaken the entire department, but words alone were no longer enough. The detectives listened carefully, their eyes darting between him and the evidence folder, silently calculating the distance between suspicion and proof. Noah's description of the crash, of Holden's manipulation and Sienna's betrayal, was consistent, precise, even hauntingly believable, but without physical evidence, the law still called it a story. It was the cruel irony of survival. He had lived through his own attempted murder, yet he still had to persuade the world it had happened. Holden sat across the table, his posture too relaxed, his arrogance barely contained beneath a thin layer of performative indignation. Sienna, beside him, looked like a mirror cracked in half, 1 part fury, 1 part fear. They claimed innocence, insisting they were victims of Noah's paranoia, casualties of a family vendetta too powerful to fight. But their words sounded rehearsed, their tones too smooth for people supposedly blindsided by accusation. The detectives remained neutral, at least outwardly, but the temperature in the room told a different story. Everyone knew that the next piece of evidence, if it existed, would decide everything. Noah's hands shook as he clutched the letter he had written before the crash. His voice cracked as he reminded them that no one writes their own obituary unless they're sure death is coming. He described again the shadowed cars, the corrupted files, the silent threats. But now, doubt crept in where certainty had lived. Every question from the detectives felt like a blade twisting deeper into his sense of reality. What if his memories had gaps? What if the evidence he once had was gone? The thought drove him to the edge. His breath grew shallow, his words rushed, and the room blurred around him. "They tried to kill me," he said again and again, the sound trembling like a prayer. "They'll do it again. I need protection. Please. I don't feel safe." Sharon's composure shattered at that moment. Watching her son unravel broke something inside her that no mother should ever feel. She rose from her seat before anyone could stop her, tears streaking down her face, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you," she said, pointing at Holden with a shaking hand that carried years of suppressed fury. "You think you can sit there and lie after what you did to him?" Nick caught her arm, but he was no calmer. His entire body pulsed with anger, his jaw tight enough to break. Every instinct in him screamed to cross the room and grab Holden by the collar, to demand answers the law was too patient to seek. The sight of his son's hollow eyes, those same eyes that had once been full of art and laughter, turned his grief into fire. Holden met Nick's glare with a cold smirk, muttering that the Newmans were masters of drama. It was the wrong thing to say. Nick lunged forward, his fist hitting the table so hard the sound echoed down the hallway. Two officers stepped in immediately, restraining him before rage could become violence. Sharon cried out, her voice breaking, and Noah shouted for them to stop, terrified that his attempt to find justice was turning into another tragedy. The room fell silent, except for the trembling of Noah's voice as he whispered, "They'll do it again." And then came the voice that cut through the chaos, not loud, not rushed, but heavy with authority that had nothing to prove. Victor Newman had entered quietly, his presence filling the room without motion. His eyes, dark and unblinking, went straight to Sienna. There was no empathy in his expression, no warmth, only the calm calculation of a man who had buried too many enemies and outlived too many wars. He stood close enough that she could feel the weight of his gaze before he spoke. "You lied," Victor said softly, each word deliberate and cold. "You hurt my grandson. And now you will answer for it." The room froze. Even the officers hesitated, sensing something primal behind his tone. Sienna's bravado cracked for the first time. Her breath hitched, and the color drained from her face. Victor's presence was not a threat of violence. It was the kind of promise that powerful men make when they are beyond the law, when their name alone becomes the sentence. Holden tried to interrupt, insisting there was no evidence that this was intimidation, but Victor didn't look at him. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed locked on Sienna, who began to shake under the silence. In that stillness, she realized that this was no longer about business or deception, it was about legacy. The Newmans protected their own, and Victor had built an empire on vengeance that the world mistook for discipline. Detectives intervened, asking for calm, promising to review the new data Noah's digital team had just submitted, fragments of corrupted drives that might contain the proof everyone demanded. But the damage was already done. Holden's face had paled, and Sienna couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The illusion of innocence had cracked beyond repair. When the police led them out for further questioning, Sharon finally collapsed against Nick, sobbing quietly while Victor stood unmoved, his hand resting on Noah's shoulder in the rarest gesture of tenderness. "You did well, my boy," he said in a low voice only Noah could hear. "Now let me take care of the rest." Noah looked up at his grandfather, still trembling but steadier now. He understood what those words meant. Justice would come, but not all of it through the courts. And as the doors closed behind Holden and Sienna, the thin line between truth and retribution disappeared into the silence that followed, leaving only the echo of a family reclaiming its strength one act of vengeance at a time.